you suffer alone, but you don't suffer in isolation. There's a passage in the book where the character says, when you start falling out of love with life, people start falling out of love with you. And it's real.
Welcome to Parent Footprint with Dr. Dan. I'm Dr. Dan. This show is about making the world a more loving, accepting, and compassionate place, one parent, one person, and one child at a time. The key to raising healthy and engaged kids is for us parents to seek the same in our own lives while striving to be the best versions of ourselves each day. No matter who you are or where you came from, with increased awareness, you can be purposeful about leaving a healthy footprint for your children, your family, and all those you care about, while living your own life to the fullest. Today's show is Male Friendship, Depression, and Grief, with our guest, Andrew Cotto. Andrew is an award-winning author of 6 novels and a novella, Pasta Mike, which we'll be talking about in depth today. A 2-time recipient of the Reader's Favorite Award, Andrew's work has been championed by Publishers Weekly, the Brooklyn Rail, Booklist, the Mother-Daughter Book Club, Mystery Scene Magazine, Raven Crime Reads, and much more. As a journalist, Andrew's a regular contributor to the New York Times, La Cucina Italiana, Brooklyn Magazine, The Good Men Project, and Rachael Ray In Season. He has also written for Parade, Men's Journal, Rolling Stone, and numerous edible publications. An avid Italophile, Andrew adores all things Italy, especially the food and wine. He also loves book club appearances. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Dan.
So I've got all these questions, of course, laid out and things I want to think about. But I have to say, after finishing Pasta Mike last night, the first thing I want to say is how sorry I am for your profound loss.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
And I get choked up even as you can, like just even saying that to you.
How do you think I feel?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, let's go there. Tell us about how you feel.
I feel, for context purposes, right? I'm sure we'll get to this, but this character of Mike in my story, it's a work of fiction. It's a novella, but it's as true to life as it gets. If it's made into a movie, it would be based on a true story, right? And the true story is very true. This character, Mike O'Shea, and I were born 5 days apart, living 5 houses apart from each other. We were baptized together. We spent our entire childhoods, adolescence, and adult lives, as the closest of friends. He died of leukemia 8 years ago, and it was devastating to me. It still is devastating to me in a way, because it's just so hard to get used to a presence that you were that intertwined with no longer being there. I think the analogy I make in the book is like if someone loses like a limb. They keep looking for that spot. They keep feeling like that ghost pain or that ghost presence of that limb. And then that's the way it is with my friend. And it's more so with him than any other loss I've experienced, including the loss of my own mother, who was probably the second person in the world who knew me the best. I think there's something really unique about losing a friend, I think, particularly for men.
Well, and that was part of the dilemma of the character, it's just a friend. It's not my mom, and how does that, these internal paradigms or rules we put on ourselves for how we should feel, how that impacts us.
Yeah, that was sort of the key to me unpacking what I was going through and really what I wanted to share in the book. I really didn't want to share it. It was quite painful, but also felt compelled to do so because I imagine it's something that lots of men wrestle with. Right, is coming to sort of grips with this sort of agony we're experiencing and then how to address it. And it was like just a friend type, that sort of excuse I was making, or that logic I was applying to it, really was a misnomer, and that it wasn't just a friend, it was a friend, right? And
Mm-hmm.
friends are wildly important to men. I think obviously they're
Mm-hmm.
important to women too, and to
Mm-hmm.
everyone, no matter
Right.
how they identify. I mean,
Right.
I get the value in friendship. I think it's particularly valuable for men because we don't recognize that necessarily on the
Right.
surface, but we internalize it. We do. Like we know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, not just thinking about Mike, but I think friends in general, are people that we are allowed to let our guard down in front of. We don't
Mm-hmm.
need to have that facade that men carry around with them. That mask we tend to wear in public. A mask of some aspect of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
When you're with your friends and you're close, you become friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are able just to relax, right, and
Right.
bare your souls and share your secrets and just be yourself in a way that you can't be with your spouse or your parents or your siblings, etc. I think there's more of a image we're guarding in those
Mm-hmm.
circumstances. When we're with other men, I believe that we no longer need to do that, and therein lies the immense value.
Mm-hmm. And the value, and also, I think the lack of awareness for us men in relationship, in the sense that, you went to the ball game, you had some beers, you play softball, you went through your chat, you build forts, you have rock fights, you do these things, but you weren't the character, and you were not aware of the profound connection and friendship, until it was gone.
Yeah, and I like to think that I knew it was a special friendship, and
Mm-hmm.
we acknowledged our love for each other all the time. Every photograph I have of us,
Mm-hmm.
we have our arms around each other. There's even
Yeah.
somewhere I'm planting a kiss on his face, just
Yeah.
jokingly, right? So and everybody knew that we were special friends, and we knew that we were special friends. I just didn't realize, how deep it went. And I think your point is really well taken in that it has to do with experiences. We don't talk on the phone. We don't write each other letters, right? We do things together. And I think by doing those things,
Mm-hmm.
there's an element of connection that is unique, and
Mm-hmm.
especially when those things are adventurous, or sort of involved in the coming of age passage, etc. Going through all these things together, are really, are quite bonding.
Mm-hmm.
I like to sort of think of it in those terms of the Malcolm Gladwell theory about excellence coming from 10,000 hours of practice, and I think
Mm-hmm.
a certain amount of hours of spent in someone else's company, right?
Mm-hmm.
It creates like I felt like in a case of me and Mike, that we spend so much time with each other that our DNA merged.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I swear I knew what he was going to say before he said it. And then the same
Mm-hmm.
thing would happen. I'd be somewhere, he'd give me a look across the room as him being like, "Don't say that, Andy. Don't,
Yeah.
he knows what I'm going to do." And it
Yeah.
was crazy. It was so, besides just being, unique, it was so comforting.
Mm-hmm. Do you do you think, men as a whole, I know this is a grand statement, are becoming more comfortable with sharing feelings, sharing e- experience, and more than experience, right? Like just sharing about oneself, getting below the surface.
Um, I'm not sure. I mean, I know, what you're alluding to. I mean, there's certainly more attention being paid to men's sensitivity and men expressing themselves. Um, but I also feel like men aren't, as maybe grown men. Perhaps I was thinking, immediately of like young men where this is sort of developed. I think young men now just don't have as many friends as they used to have. Their lives are so much different than my generations. Where we grew up adventuring, for lack of a better term,
Right.
of
Right.
going out and doing things, just playing hours and hours and hours and hours of pickup basketball and etc. And I don't think that they spend as much time in each other's company, and certainly that company is more select. As far as
Mm-hmm.
grown men go, I guess I don't know. It's hard to
Yeah.
really tell if I know the emphasis is out there. I don't know if it's working.
Yeah, that's I agree with that. And there's the whole concept of toxic masculinity that is talked about a lot, and all the parts of quote being a man that aren't good for the man or good for those they're in relationship with. And I think we just have to keep getting the message out. I mean, there's a reason. One of the reasons it's thought that women as a subspecies live longer than men is because of their relationships and their ability to express to each other, and it would do us men well to seek that as in our own lives.
Agreed. I agree. That's why women live longer for and other reasons too. I think they probably treat their bodies better than we treat ours. In many ways. So I think there's a spiritual, emotional side and the physical side. But yeah, I back to your point about toxic masculinity. I think there's also a muzzle on men these days too. Like don't say the wrong thing, right? Or be careful with how you express yourself, because if you're expressing yourself like what you're being encouraged to do, you might step in the wrong pile, and then you're in bigger trouble. So it's an interesting time for men, in the public sphere at least, about what is acceptable, what is not, and I certainly come across plenty of men who I feel like are living 20 years ago with the way they the language they use and the way they behave. I also see men who are so careful.
Right.
And so sensitive about the impression that they might give and the way they speak that they're no fun to hang out with.
Yeah. That even happens in New York, huh?
Yeah. Can you believe it? Yeah. I mean, not with my friends, but yeah.
Grief.
Oof.
Yeah. You've described grief through the character in your book, and it was painful. Like it was painful. I also have to say, I completely lost sight that it was a novella as I was reading it. Like it was real, totally real. That was you. Mike was Mike in all the details. And the grief was real. The pain was real. Like, how do you put words? I mean, you did in the book, but it's also the question is like, how can you put words to that feeling?
Well, I guess if I wasn't a writer, I would have a harder time with it. And even though I am a writer, it was really difficult. And I was, part of what I alluded to before about feeling sort of compelled to tell the story was I know that it's not easy to put words to these things. It's not easy for people, and I think men in particular, to explain what this feels like. So, part of my motivation was being, a conscious contributor to the awareness part. So I sort of fought through the difficulties of it, and tried to be as articulate as possible about it, but also as relatable. I didn't want to over intellectualize it or try and get too poetic about it. I just wanted to explain what it felt like, instead of just I wanted to show the character of Andy really suffering. And it was hard to do, but it's a lot easier than living it. That's for sure.
Yeah. Is that sidebar here? Was there ever a time that you thought about doing a memoir as opposed to fiction?
Yeah, the original concept actually was a memoir. I was going to call it Mike O'Shea, a memoir. And I thought that would have been such a great, catchy title, like a memoir about someone else. And it was going to be about our friendships. And that's what I began to do. And it was just too overwhelming from a content standpoint. I mean, a memoir is a form of biography. And I'd have to cover both of our lives, and be true to his family and his siblings and his loved ones and his girlfriends and his wife and his children and his friends growing up and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time being true to mine. And I just found it overwhelming, especially because Mike is a really enormous figure. And I don't know if I was able to convey that. But
you were.
He's a special human being who knew, in real life, 2,000 people came to his wake. I mean, he was a hero, and so I just didn't feel I was up to the task of truly reflecting on his life. So what I did, and this device hit me in the middle of the night, it changed this whole project because I was struggling, was to just take me and him the two I care about most in this book, and take us out of our real lives and plunk us down somewhere fictional. So I did that. So I lifted us from our actual hometown of Glen Rock, New Jersey, which is in Bergen County, just over the George Washington Bridge, and dropped us down in a neighborhood in Queens, which is pretty similar, demographically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had you in Queens and Brooklyn. You're in my head there. So with the fiction, you didn't have to. Yeah, that would be completely overwhelming to think about everything that you said. Did you know what grief was?
No, I've been saving this beef for a long time, but one of the things that my complaints with adulthood in general is that I don't think we're prepared enough for the big things in life. Even the joyous things, like, oh, you're getting married? How wonderful. You're going to love being married. It's the best thing in the world. You'll be partners forever. And no one tells you how hard it is. Oh, you're going to have a kid? Oh, you're going to love parenting. You're going to be the best dad. You're going to be so good. And no one told you how hard it's going to be. Death, people, I don't understand why we don't all get like, YouTube channels dedicated to teaching us about death or something, because it's so hard to deal with. As I mentioned before, and I would say loss in general, but death in particular, my mother died a few years before Mike, and I'd once written that the two people in the world who knew me the best and loved me regardless were my mother and Mike. They're my two favorite people. And when she died, it was really hard, and she died too young for sure. But she was in her 70s. Mm-hmm. But my concern was with my dad. My feelings about her death were really wondering how my dad was going to get through it, because they were so close. And I experienced some grief, but it was sort of like I was occupied. When Mike passed, it was a different sort of experience. Like, I just couldn't hide from it. For me, as I mentioned in the book, it is, that relentlessness of the memory. How many times a day, I would think about Mike, and every time I thought about him, it just bummed me out. That's a kind way of saying
understatement.
It, right? And it just wouldn't go away. Just, it just kept coming back, and then there's a watershed moment in the book where the character gets some really good news, right? And the character of Andy, and he, he instinctively reaches for his phone to call Mike and rings him up, and sees his name on the ringer, and collapses. Something similar to that happened to me. I won't share that anecdote with you, but it's better in the fictionalized version. But that part of the grief, my complaint again about not being prepared for it is that you get all this advice when something like this happens from people like, oh, you'll get used to it, you'll go through these phases of grief, and then you'll learn to live, and there'll be a new normal, and all these sort of colloquialisms that are thrown at you, and I just wanted to bang my head against the wall, and people would take me aside, because I'm like, no, I'm not seeing it like this. You can tell me that I'll get used to the new normal, but like, really? When?
What would have been helpful to know if you were prepared? So if you were prepared, and how we can be prepared ourselves, and then prepare our children for life.
I would not undersell it. I would say this is going to be brutal, right? It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot. It's not going to be okay. It might be. I'm not saying I'm not a pessimist about this, or a fatalist about it, but I think more of an emphasis on the challenge of it, as opposed to underemphasizing the challenge, and putting it into like, cliche and throwaway phrases would be really helpful. I also think that, I think that, when someone passes away who's, at a certain level of closeness to you, that there should be therapy available. There should be part of our healthcare program. And I guess me as Mike's friend would have to write like a request. But I think immediate family, etc. It just should be part of it. I mean, one of the reasons my dad was so successful in working his way through the loss of my mother, his wife, 50 years plus, was that he went to counseling groups, and it
Yeah.
was like, it wasn't
Yeah.
even like a choice. I mean, he had a choice, and he sat around in a room with a bunch
Mm-hmm.
of people who've gone through the same thing, right? He had a
Right.
one-on-one guy who helped him, this guy, I
Yeah.
think it was Mel or something,
Yeah.
who like said, this is what happened to me. And then people in the group were helping, and there was professionals around too. So, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think that should be, you can't make it mandatory, of course, but it should be
Right.
available.
And normal, right? Like
Oh
or
yeah.
typical, just a thing that you do.
I'm,
Yeah, and I don't want to just highlight what you said for the listeners is when it comes to grief, group work is so powerful. Of course, individual work for anything is helpful. Group work is so powerful to see that you are not alone in your pain and to be able to process with others who are going through it and support one another is healing. Not easy, but healing.
It's a really good point, and that was one of the things that really sort of wrecked me, was that I really did feel so alone.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to bother his wife and
Mm-hmm.
his children and his siblings. They thought they had their own thing going on. They were a separate entity. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought they were obviously more, in need of that thing or worthy of it. I guess I don't know. But like the feeling, the isolation was compounded by the fact that the person I would have gone to
Mm-hmm.
to talk about these things with was the one who was missing.
Right. Right. What from your experience would you say is the crossover or the difference between grief and depression? And if you feel there's a distinction, did you know when it happened?
I think the depression comes in when the grief just becomes so unrelenting. So I don't know. There's a crossover. I think there's probably a symbiosis between them,
Mm-hmm.
where I got depressed by the fact that I kept feeling grief and it wasn't going away, and it was changing who I was. In the book, the character says that he could feel himself start to become less. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is certainly something that I became aware of, and that really bummed me out too. I'm
Mm-hmm.
using good language
Right.
for a family show here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it became so exhausting. I think I'm speaking as someone who only has their own experience and no training in mental health, but I feel like depression is sort of a form of exhaustion with
Mm-hmm.
sorrow
Mm-hmm.
and coping.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of talk about it just within the field of psychology and in the diagnostic labels and the diagnostic manual is, how long is, pathologizing grief. First of all, one is to have it actually be a diagnosis when many people like it's a natural occurrence to losing someone you love and care about. Is that
Right.
actually a medical diagnosis? So there's that whole aspect. And then timelines, like there is no timeline for grief. People grieve differently. Some people don't shed a tear until a year later when their cat dies and they can't get off the floor. I mean,
Right.
there's so many different ways that this happens. And then depression, the thought of depression, as you're saying, it's more and it's too much. And then you have all of those really grief symptoms, maybe on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like there's similar symptoms. You don't have pleasure. Your mood is low. You have trouble concentrating. You might have sleep and appetite problems. Even depressive thoughts. That
Mm-hmm.
happens all in grief, and those are the symptoms of depression.
Yeah, I mean they certainly work together, and but I understand, obviously you have to have grief first, right? But differentiating them is
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know why.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the way in my my psychology cap. Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I'm thinking like, why? My psychology cap, trying to help people understand and be aware of how they're feeling and what would be a natural way to feel. And then I think here it is, Andrew. And then when does that natural way of feeling become just too much? And you're in a whole nother place. And, as you said, getting help would have been helpful.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think there's any other solution. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's no other way around it, I believe, than help. So I think if you keep trying to work your way through it on your own, which I did, right,
Mm-hmm.
it just compounds.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually it subsides because I don't think attend the requisite energy to it, eternally. But this process for me was years and years and years, and I'm absolutely of the belief that could have been attended to earlier in the period and been of much greater benefit to me
Mm-hmm.
and those around me. I mean, this is you don't
Yeah.
you suffer alone, but you don't suffer in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
There's a passage in the book where the character says, when you start falling out of love with life, people start falling out of love with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's real.
And you described that impact well
Thank you.
in the book with Andy's family. Did you end up going to therapy?
No, I didn't, and
Wow.
believe me, I wish I had. And I advocate for therapy. I taught as a professor for 15 years, and my students, millennials at first, and then Gen Z, were very open about mental health, etc. And I always tried to be as open with them as possible and said, like, why don't we all have therapists? And we all have medical doctors, right? Some guys check out my cholesterol every other year or whatever, and my blood pressure. Why isn't someone checking in on my mental health? So I was trying to, help them understand, how not just normal it should be, but how necessary it is. And then I'm a hypocrite because I was in such a situation, and my rationale, I think, is partially rooted in the age old practice of men not getting help, or people in general, but men in particular. Right. How do I go about getting a therapist? What do I do? Right. And then just my denial about what I was enduring, and it's a massive regret of mine, because I'm pretty sure my life would have ended up differently.
As you say, it's such common sense. We go to our annual physical. Like, how about an annual wellness mental health checkup? Like one a year.
That should be weekly. Forget annual. It should be weekly.
Yeah. I'm just, like, what's possible in the insurance system? Like 1.5 hour appointment a year. Come on, something.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, they would never get me off the couch. It was only once a year, but yes, I mean, I can't believe that we don't build this into the program, because it would affect our physical health in such a way. If I'm an insurance company, I'd want people getting therapy. Right? Yeah. It's going to keep them out of the MD's office.
Right. Also, Andy, Andy was dealing the best way that Andy could deal. I mean, Andy was having medicinal martinis, right, as a way to cope. And we know that drinking is a common way to go numb, at least temporarily. But there's a fine line between having a few drinks and then using it to cope and go numb, or maybe it's not so fine.
Yeah, I don't know what the contour of that line is, but yeah, it's definitely there, and it is. I get it. I mean, that part was very true. I was absolutely succoring myself with alcohol. The medicinal martini is a nice little phrase, but it's still vodka in a glass, right? And I get it. I mean, I was always. I enjoy alcohol. I drink tons. I'm a Italianophile. I drink tons of wine.
Yeah, we're gonna get to the wine part. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And a big part of my life with Mike was us drinking together. We were a great pair in that respect. But I never drank, like I did, in my life prior to that point. Where it was it was just so consistent, and I get the reason. It made the pain go away. And then this sounds like just an excuse, but it really did. Right? It was such a insidious little practice. I don't know who invented alcohol. But that idea of what it does to the feeling we have as human beings is why it's persisted, and why people drink all over the world. Besides the enjoyment, there's that one shade of it where it's like, woohoo,
Yep.
let's do the Charleston. And there's another part where it's like, it is just helping you numb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there an awakening with that part of your life, or was it slow and gradual?
Yeah, I didn't have, I didn't crash my car into a tree or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully,
Yeah.
and I think I behaved fairly responsibly for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But no, there wasn't any sort of enlightenment moment. I just got tired of being tired, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Food and wine. Well,
yes.
actually, okay. This is the precursor question, so we might have to hold off, or it might go straight into that. Which is, what positive coping mechanisms did you ultimately find?
Exercise. I mean, exercise is, it has, because of this, exercise has become a regular part of my routine, and I care less about, how big my biceps are, or how fast I can run X amount of miles. It is that release that comes from exercise that is such a mental benefit, has such a mental benefit, I should say. I mean, I just, I'm noticeably in a different mood after I exercise than before. It also happens to be something that Mike was really proficient in. He's
Yes.
huge. He's a
Yeah.
bodybuilder and a weightlifting champion. And so he loved working out like no one
Yeah.
ever met. And so when I work out, he's with me.
Yeah.
He's always making me do more reps, and he's always giving me a hard time, and he's always encouraging me. So there's that sort of ability to join him, but it's also what it really most importantly what it does to my head, for lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better term.
And I resonated with that as well when Mike was telling you in the book about it's not just about physical, it's about, emotional and spiritual. And my running in the morning is purely for mental health. Like
Yeah.
it's the physical parts, the byproduct, feels secondary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wish there was more emphasis on that, because I mean it is something we can do, that everyone can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's just walking, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is great medicine.
So anyone who's one of the things to try to achieve when one has experienced profound grief is to find meaning again, right? And to be able to re-engage and to have a life after. Um, this was my question. Does food and wine have anything to do with that process for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I always love food, and I'm a food writer in part. Even my novels have food in them, not just
Mm-hmm.
Pasta Mike. I mean, actually,
Yeah.
Pasta Mike has food in the title, but there's
Yeah.
probably more actual cooking and eating and enjoying of food in the previous books, including especially the two that are set in Italy. I'm an
Mm-hmm.
Italiophile, as mentioned. I've always loved eating and drinking. It's been one of my favorite things in life. It's one of the things I did with Mike. More than we didn't play golf together on occasion, but
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
wanted to eat. That was our
Yeah.
thing, and that's what I do with most of my dear friends. It's one of my favorite things to do. But since this experience, my appreciation for it and the value of it has really resonated, and I've I do believe that food and wine, are great sources of wellness, of mental wellness, because there's so many components of it. But at the end of the day, I feel like when you are sitting around the table with people that you care about, you're at church. You're
Mm-hmm.
communing with them,
Mm-hmm.
and those are the moments when I realize that I'm the most happy. So I sought them out, and I also truly believe that eating good food stimulates our brains in ways,
Mm-hmm.
stimulates our body, being healthy. As people say to me, "Cotto, you love food so much. Why aren't you the X amount of pounds heavier?" And I say, because I carefully choose what I eat, and I choose the right quantities, so I feel good too. And yes, part of it's like, hey, I'm in good shape, fine. There's that sort of ego boost thing, but it's I think truly there's a mental health connection between the quality of food we put in our bodies, right, and the feeling we have, going through our daily lives. Our digestion, our moods, right, our energy, etc. So I'm actually in the process of creating a proposal, which I'm really late about doing, for a nonfiction book called Eat, Drink, Be Healthy.
Ah, Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
That goes right to what I was just going to ask you when it comes to wine and health, right? And so I saw lots of pictures of you with the red wine. You look really good with a glass of red wine.
Thank you.
And we think of Italy and we think of the villages where people are all living over 100 and they have wine every day. And like there's so much, people debate that all the time. From your perspective and from what you know, how is wine healthy? And how do you see drinking in that context?
I'm not convinced that wine is healthy. I think that there's obviously what I consider to be the devil of all ingredients, which is sugar in wine. I think there's probably some antioxidants in it. But I think the people who drink wine every day also happen to be the people who eat really well. Mediterraneans, for example. Right? So I think the diet that comes from the land where wine is also grown, olive oil, etc., beautiful fruits and vegetables. I think that's why they live to 100, and they get to do so while drinking wine because they eat so well. Plus, I do think that that relaxation period of it. I think wine is a great way to drink without being a martini, or a bucket of vodka, right? I think no offense. Forgive me, I'm going to stereotype, but I think the Russian lifespan is probably much less than the Italian lifespan, right? That's probably the reason.
Right. And
no offense to the Russians.
Yeah, of course, none. And related to other podcasts we've had on teenage, just alcohol use, alcohol abuse, substance abuse. When we were going to school, going to college, it was beer. Mm-hmm. And these days, it's fashionable to be taking handle pulls of vodka, of gin, so right, that goes to your system in a different way than a slower alcohol content beverage.
Absolutely, I also think it has a different physiological effect on you too. Mm-hmm. And vodka, I mean, it makes few people happier and more friendly. It can get you angry quickly. Mm-hmm. Same with like gin. I think a lot of these hard alcohols just have a different impact on our bodies and our minds.
Yes. So, I'm going back now. I'm preparing you for this question because it's not the food wine question. What would you say you learned the most from Mike?
My favorite thing about Mike, and I'm so fortunate to have this as his greatest quality, was his enormous capacity for love. He's, as I mentioned, sort of a larger than life figure, right? And he could have easily walked through life and been popular and successful and got all the things that come along, all the trappings that come along with being well known and popular, for lack of a better term. But he was so interested in other people and being kind to people. He's again, he's massive. No one could ever threat. He was a martial arts fighter. No one was any threat to him, right? He didn't need to be nice to other people as a means of popularity or safety. But it was nice to people by choice, and I love that about him. He was also really good, at picking out the person who needs the attention. We go to a bar and there's some person there hanging out against the wall by themselves. He's over there in a minute, buying them a drink and putting his arm around them and engaging them. Right? He was like that as a kid. It developed through adolescence. As an adult, he was a rock star, and I love that fact that his empathy was so profound and shared.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that resonated with me, Mike. And I thought you hit this well. Mike was dyslexic. He had a learning challenge. And I am. I have several. My family is. And you hit on some of his experiences, just briefly, like on some of those experiences of what it was like in school with a very successful family, siblings, having that learning challenge. But what was so clear is I want to also put it through the dyslexic lens, because we talk a lot about neurodiversity as well, is Mike had so many strengths, man. He read a room, he read people, he was emotionally in tune, right? I mean, it was like he had this relational gift, as you describe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dyslexia part of his life is also important to. It's also important to recognize while talking about it. That this was in the 70s when we didn't diagnose dyslexia. I mean, forgive me for saying this. I'm probably going to get in trouble, but people just called him stupid.
Yeah,
His.
short bus. You get on the little yellow
Yeah,
bus.
I mean that was his reputation. Mike's stupid. He can't read. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't just hear that from the cruel kids, right? I remember his
Mm-hmm.
mother called him that once because she was so mad at him, because he was doing so poorly in school,
Mm-hmm.
And I knew it broke his heart. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he despised the fact that he not only had this label of not being smart when he knew he was smart, right? But also that he had to go to summer school every year. It was humiliating, right? Every summer, right? We'd be jerking around all day long in the summer. It was a huge neighborhood of kids, right? And Mike was always every morning he had to go back to St. Catherine's.
Yeah.
Right. And the humiliation, and not just because he didn't get to be with us, because he had to be in his least favorite place in the world, and that was a classroom.
Right.
He hated
Right.
school, right? Sitting
Right.
still. I'm sure he had ADHD too. He couldn't sit
Yeah.
still. Right? He was
Mm-hmm.
tortured by it. And no one knew. Right? No one
Mm-hmm.
knew. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I often think that so many people that become tacky term, but outcasts in
Mm-hmm.
society, people who get in
Mm-hmm.
trouble with the law, people who join gangs, etc. Do so because they don't feel comfortable at school, right? So they seek comfort elsewhere, or brotherhood, or whatever elsewhere, and that originates with a learning difference of some sort, right? And they don't. It's not seen, right? Or diagnosed, early enough or at all. And even if it is, the resources to attend to it are just not there. I mean, there's so many schools now where they specialize exclusively in learning differences. It's a beautiful thing, and you see
Mm-hmm.
how these kids can find a way to success. It's such a great change in the way we live, right? And all
Mm-hmm.
these poor kids who didn't have that luxury. But even that said, right, it still exists in a way today that's a disadvantage. But in Mike's case, he turned it into an advantage.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. And you're just stressing the importance of identification and awareness, and for parents and teachers to know what a learning disability is, or we call a learning difference, or now we call neurodiversity. And it, when not detected and not supported, it has lifelong effects on one's identity.
I mean,
It's the messages you get and how you feel.
the self-esteem part. I mean, in fact,
Yeah.
I think if people were treating me, like they were treating Mike as a kid, it would have been devastating. I would have become either a delinquent or a wallflower. Right? And in fact, I love the stories of people who, become really successful in life, and they say, so and so had a learning disability growing up, right? And they figured their way around it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then invented Apple, whatever. I don't know if those guys,
Yeah.
whatever. But there's a great
Right.
success story. I think Elon Musk has a learn, but whatever, right?
Yes.
But there's
Yes.
also there's the rest of us,
Right.
the other
Yes.
99.999% of the world who
Yes.
don't achieve that thing and have their story championed. But Mike's case was a really great example of someone taking that
Mm-hmm.
weakness, if you call it that.
Yes.
I love the term difference because it is a difference. It's not even a
Mm-hmm.
deficiency; it's a difference,
Mm-hmm.
right? And figuring out how they learn
Mm-hmm.
and what to do with it.
And it is a fact that there is a disproportionately high number of dyslexic entrepreneurs and inventors. The brain thinking differently comes up with different things.
Yeah,
So very
agreed.
cool.
In the cases where they're able to do so, and as opposed to if they had the resources around them, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Absolutely. What have you taken away from the process of losing Mike and the grief? How has your life, how has it changed you and your life?
I don't know. I mean, I think about this a lot, and I'd love to be able to find some sort of silver lining to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really just can't. And I think that's the part that, no matter what, no matter how I'd gone through this, and I wish I could have done so more effectively,
Mm-hmm.
with less pain for me and those around me. I still don't know at the end of the day, what I can look back and say, well, there's this at least,
Yeah.
I mean, because I was just out with Mike's wife for dinner last Saturday, another friend of ours who'd lost two very close people to him. And like, that ache doesn't,
Right.
it's not replaceable. Right?
Right.
When someone said to me recently, I was talking about this, they said, life is for the living. And I thought, I kind of get that. I mean, that one of all the cliches or all the advice you get, all the armchair advice you get, that kind of resonated for me. And I like to think that I've gained something from this, but perspective, perhaps, but I can't identify it. I mean, I'd do anything.
Yeah.
I'd do anything to not have it be the case.
Yeah. For those listening who are grieving or have someone close to them grieving, what is the one thing you would suggest?
I mean, I think we covered this earlier, and it bears repeating. I think getting help. Immediately recognizing the fact that you're heading for a boatload of agony. Right? And don't suck it up. Don't think you're going to work your way through it by yourself. Right? Don't try and be tough. You'll get help. It doesn't have to be a therapist. But I think the group one you mentioned before is a really good idea. I mean, that idea there about the group thing is really what helped me write the book, and that I think it will make this, encourage people to do that. To recognize that. I mean, I'd written an article. This book sort of was born out of an article I wrote for TALKSPACE.
Yep, I got it right here. Great article.
About the loss of Mike. And I got quite a few notes from people who read it afterwards saying, "Hey, I lost my buddy. Right? I lost, this guy is like, I met this guy like 5 years ago, and I'm still wiped out. Or as my college friend, or and of course some childhood ones too. But like that need to recognize that this is not like." It's worthy of attention, even if they're just your friend and not your spouse or parent or sibling or child. It's up there. It's a big loss.
Yeah. You just gave me a memory, and also because of Mike's occupation, or I should say occupations. A close friend of mine from high school died about 10 years ago, and we had lost touch in our later years, and I flew down with another close friend of ours for the funeral. And my friend was a police officer, and his best friend and neighbor, a next door neighbor, shared a fence, was a firefighter. And when that firefighter, and of course there were hundreds of firefighters, police officers, parades, all of that stuff. When his best friend, the firefighter, spoke, he stood there and he said, and I'll never forget this, "I stand before you a broken man." And I felt it then, feel it now, and maybe those are also some words what it feels like when you lose someone so close to you.
I'm getting out poetics by a fireman. It's true, and Mike was a cop in real life, law enforcement official, so he had his wake and funeral were attended to by law enforcement, in a big way, lots of bagpipes and etc. But I made Mike in the novella a firefighter because I felt like the firefighters of New York City, and Mike was the character of Mike was a participant in 9/11 rescue and the recovery afterwards, and his illness, his death results from the toxicity that he was absorbing, for days upon end. Probably also with some trauma.
Right.
And I really wanted to pay tribute to firemen because I know they're pretty good, right, at speaking about the brotherhood they share with their fellow laddermen. But come on, I mean, these are firemen, right?
Yeah.
They certainly do the pageantry well with the bagpipes, and they show up. There's thousands of them at these funerals, or hundreds of them there. They come and they have wreaths and photos, but I don't think they're getting counseling. I don't think eating chili in the fire station is counts.
Right.
Though they're sitting around together. But I really wanted to raise awareness about the firefighters of New York City because they did suffer such loss on that day and the days after.
Yeah. And they have been heroes in California and in our forests of it just absolute
Absolutely.
heroes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's an amazing profession, and
Yeah.
in my next life, I'm going to either be a cop or a fireman or a bartender.
I could see a few of those happening. All right, we're about to go the parent footprint moment question, but I have to share this this meme, something you said about could we just get educated about adulthood matters, like about getting married and about marriage and about parenting,
Mm-hmm.
So here's a meme I'll share that she sent me yesterday. Here it says, and this is from Dad Man Walking, which I think is a funny name. If you're struggling with your toddlers now, don't worry. It changes. Not for the good, though. It actually gets worse, way worse, like horrifying. I hope this helps you.
I love it. That's great. Parenting is in any circumstance is immensely complicated, and
Yes.
I wish there was more sort of
Yes.
recognition of that. That meme might do it all.
Yeah, and I think that we there's a reason we don't really know the full picture, because that might prevent some things. It's challenging.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think there'd be a child crisis, like a population crisis, if everybody knew the truth.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, and for those of you who are expecting, it's an amazing adventure.
Yes, okay. You're going to be the best mom and dad.
Yeah. Okay. Parent footprint moment question, Andrew.
All right.
Tell us about a time that you became aware of yourself as an individual, as a parent, or an awareness of your parents, and that new awareness had a positive impact on your child, your life, and those you love.
Yeah, that was an easy one for me to come up with an answer to, because a story I tell from my childhood is that, as I mentioned my mother a few times before, she was a fabulous woman, just a very dynamic, lovely, classy, fun woman, and so much of my personality is really derived from her. I look just like her. But I remember as a kid, she loved me, so much. And she used to always tell me that she loved me, but she used to also do so in a way where she'd take me and squeeze me into her and say, I'm going to put you in the freezer so you never grow up. Can I do that? Can I do that, Andy? And she'd always say that to me. And I didn't think of it as a threat, of course. Like, oh my God, someone might look at that now and be like, that's a threat of violence. She was, she was explaining that she loved me so much she didn't want me to get any older. She always wanted to be her little boy. And knowing that as a little boy, that you mean so much to someone in your life, especially someone who's so close to you, right? It's very empowering. And I walk through life with great confidence. Right? All this other stuff aside about my breakdown. But I've lived my life with great confidence and have, I don't fear things. I don't have anxiety about things. I am courageous as a person, and it's benefited me immensely, in my endeavors, my changing of careers, the way I've lived my life, there's everything, right? But, and I really think, and I've always thought that was rooted in my mother's open and often, acclamation of her love for me.
Unconditional and unyielding love.
Yeah.
That you knew, that you felt, that was expressed. Yeah.
So there was what I like about that anecdote is that it's both showing and telling. She's telling me something with her words, but she's also hugging me and doing so in a way that's so dynamic, right? And she's like, I'm gonna put you in the freezer. It was just it was moving.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you got a lot of works out there. You've got a lot of irons in the fire, and you're doing a lot with food and wine and enjoying yourself. So tell everyone where they can follow your expeditions.
Sure. I have a website, obviously. It's Andrew Cotto, COTTO.com. And on it, you can link to my novels and my articles. And a lot of the articles are food-based with recipes. I'm on social media. My Instagram page is probably the place I'm the most active because I love the idea of using photographs to tell stories, but also post my articles up there. It's at Andrew Cotto. My YouTube channel has my cooking show, which is called Dinner with Andrew. I was thinking that before, and you said this is the Parent Trap with Dr. Dan. I'm Dr. Dan. I have to do the same thing. I say this is Dinner with Andrew. I'm Andrew.
Doesn't it seem a bit repetitive?
I know, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, I know.
Say this is Dr. Dan. Who's Dr. Dan? Right? I mean, I think you can assume you're Dr. Dan, right? But you might not be, right?
That's funny.
So I have this fledgling cooking show on there with my buddy Daniel Paterna, the creative director here in New York, my neighbor and friend, and I do Italian cooking demonstrations with lots of humor. I mean, last time I dropped a frittata on the floor, trying to flip it. There's all that, and yeah, I mean, I love hearing from readers. I expect I'll hear from a lot of readers when Pasta Mike comes out. So I'm happy to sort of chat and share if I can and be of help. I think the book itself does the work that I intended to do, but I'm always happy to talk to people and go to book clubs, and I'm probably the most extroverted writer I've ever met. I love people.
Yeah, just like Mike. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing yourself with us and for writing Pasta Mike. It had an impact on me, and I'll tell everyone that you quickly are part of the story. And it's one of those things that you want to know the whole story, and you just keep reading until you do.
Thank you.
So everyone, that concludes our meaningful episode for today. We appreciate your support of this show with your 5-star reviews. Please send this episode to anyone who you think will benefit. And we are always enjoying people becoming part of our community. Do your best to be that person that you would like your child to become. Model it, show it, do it, speak it. And as always, ask yourself the guiding question: what footprint do you want to leave? This has been a Peters and Rossi production. Parent Footprint with Dr. Dan is produced by Laura Rossi. Our engineer is Phil Rossi. Theme music is Strummerman, composed and performed by Pro Tunes. Artwork is by Garrett Ross. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Parent Footprint Podcast, and on Twitter at Dr. Dan Peters. If you are an advertiser interested in advertising on our show, go to midroll.com/ads. For more information, go to exactlyrightmedia.com. Listen, subscribe, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want more of Parent Footprint with Dr. Dan, check out our bonus episode